Okay, so now that we've looked at chapter one, the period before the British came to Singapore, we're now going to look at the British in Singapore. So, as we know from the 1600s all the way to the 1800s, Singapore was quite a quiet place. There was not a lot going on because it had faced a period of decline in the 1600s. Okay, but this was going to change in the 1800s. Okay, so today we're going to look at chapter two. How did Singapore become a British trading post? So in this chapter, you will learn the following. So firstly, we will look at why the British were interested in Southeast Asia in late 18th century. But they would also face some problems in attempting to establish a trading presence here in Southeast Asia. So what were these problems? And then why did the British end up choosing Singapore of all places? And fourthly, what did the British do to develop Singapore as a settlement between 1819 and 1826? Okay, so and we're going to focus on the role of the following individuals: Stamford Raffles, William Farquhar, and John Crawford. Okay, so for today's lesson, we're going to look at 1 and 2. So why the British were interested in Southeast Asia, and what were some problems they faced in attempting to establish a trading presence over here in the region. Okay, so we're going to start with why the British were interested in Southeast Asia. So essentially, they were interested in Southeast Asia for two main reasons. And the first reason was the India-China trade that we also looked at in chapter 1, right? The importance of the India-China trade. And secondly, the British were also interested in this thing called the spice trade, which was very lucrative, okay, and it had a lot of activity in this region. But to start, let me give you some background on the British East India Company. Okay, so the British East India Company would be the major party here that would make a lot of inroads into the region. Okay, so it was a company supported by the British Crown itself. So it was formed on 31st December 1600. And basically, it represented the British government's trade interest in the East, okay, in Asia. So it looked at places like Southeast Asia, China, and also India. So what it really wanted to do was to establish a strong British control of trade and earn trade profits for the British. And it even grew so powerful that it had its own government in India. It had its own army and its own navy. Okay, it was very, very powerful. And it also acted as an agent to represent the British colonial expansion in Southeast Asia and also China. So, if we look at the following graphic, why do you think the India-China trade was so important to the British? Okay, so you may pause the video here and think about, why the India-China trade was so crucial to British interests at this point in time. So essentially, if you have thought about it, it's all about the exchange of resources, right, between the two places. Okay, so as we know that the East India Company had control over much of India by the late 18th century. Okay, so the late 1700s, and the British realized that trade between China and India was a major source of income, right, for the British East India Company, because essentially, okay, we can also focus and look at your notes right now and key in some keywords over here. So yeah, as we follow this lecture, okay, take note of some keywords, some key ideas that you should be jotting down on your worksheet. Okay. So firstly, from Britain and from India, right, they could sell things like cotton, opium, and also wool to China. And in return, China could offer Britain tea, silk, and porcelain. Okay, very, very precious products. And however, the British needed to control the Straits of Malacca, as you can see on the map, because it's right in the middle of the India-China trade, the route, right? So if you have control over the Straits of Malacca, the British could then protect the India-China trade. So secondly, we look at the lucrative spice trade that the British also became very interested in. Okay, so can you name some of these spices? So the first one, can you name this one? Yeah, they are cloves, right? What about this one? Yeah, it's cinnamon. And this one is named after its shape. Yeah, it's a star anise. And this one might be slightly more difficult. It's actually the nutmeg. Okay. So, hmm, essentially from the 1400s onwards, spices from Asia became very, very valuable. And they were seen as valuable as gold. So actually a few bags of spices, right, could actually be so valuable that they could pay for the journey from Malaya all the way to Britain at this point in time. Okay, and therefore, because they were so valuable, they were in high demand. So, why do you think spices were in such high demand? What do you think spices were used for at that time? So, they were essentially used for, firstly, at that point in time, because we didn't have refrigerators, for example, they were used for preserving food. And as they still are used for today, they are used in cooking. And during that time, they were also used for medicinal purposes. And so, because of the value of these spices, the European powers competed with each other for control of the spice trade in Southeast Asia because essentially, spice was wealth. However, the British did face some problems in attempting to establish a trading presence in Southeast Asia. So, what were these problems? Firstly, as we know, as we learned about this in the first chapter, actually the Dutch started to establish their own powerful presence within the region. And essentially they had the monopoly of trade in the region, so total control of trade in the region. And since the 17th century, the British had competed with the Dutch for trade outside of Europe. And however, in this region, the Dutch actually controlled a larger part of Southeast Asia than the British did. So essentially, the Dutch were already the dominant trade power in Southeast Asia by the 18th century. And as mentioned, they had the monopoly of the spice trade at this time. And the Dutch also had control of ports like Batavia, which is today's Jakarta, and Malacca. Okay, and because of this control, the Dutch could control shipping and access to trade ports, right? Because they controlled the Straits of Malacca and also the Sunda Straits, okay, which you should be quite familiar with by now. So this was the first major problem that the British faced, the Dutch monopoly of trade. A second problem the British also faced was the unsuitability of their existing ports in the region. Okay, so now you can take your textbook out and read page 49. Okay, so and think about your responses to these questions. So firstly, which were the two ports the British had in Southeast Asia? Okay, so on your worksheet, you will see a map over here. So firstly, before you label the map, okay, write down what these two ports are. After having identified the two ports, mark them out on the map, okay? And then later, mark out the Straits of Malacca. And then having read the page, also think about why these two ports were unsuitable, okay? And identify the reasons for their unsuitability. Okay, so you can pause the video here right now and take about 5 minutes to 7 minutes maybe to complete this activity. Okay, so you can pause right now. Okay, so you should have completed the activity by now. So essentially, what were the two ports? Okay, so essentially the first port was Penang and the second one was Bencoolen. Okay, so these were the two ports, and I hope you have marked them out correctly on your maps. So why were these two ports unsuitable? Okay, so you should also have these reasons written down on your worksheet. So for Penang, essentially it was too far north, right, to the Straits of Malacca, okay? It was not useful for controlling the Straits of Malacca or protecting British ships because it was so far north, okay, from the Straits of Malacca. And Bencoolen was even worse, right? It was situated on the western side of Sumatra, as you can see on the map. And it was not along the main trade route between India and China at all. Okay, so it was also unsuitable as a trading port for the British. Okay. So essentially, we've come to the end of this lesson for HBL. So in the next lesson, when you come back to school, we'll look at, since these ports were also unsuitable, why did the British end up choosing Singapore, right? Eventually.